Welcome to Murder in the Air Mystery Theater. I'm your host, Laurie Fagen. In this podcast series, I'll interview authors who will then read their mystery, suspense, or thriller short stories or a chapter from their published books. In addition, sprinkled throughout the coming weeks, the podcast will feature radio theater style sections from the audiobooks for my 3 crime fiction novels. Today on Murder in the Air Mystery Theater, our guest is Betty Webb from Scottsdale, Arizona, author of the Lena Jones series about a female private eye, the Gun Zoo mysteries about a zoo worker, and now the Paris mysteries with the first Lost in Paris. Welcome to the podcast, Betty.
Oh, thank you. It's fun to be here.
According to your website, Betty, you were a lonely only and started reading at about age 4. And by the age of 9, you were making up your own word games to keep yourself entertained.
Right.
So do you play Wordle or any of the other word games out today, or does your writing keep those words and phrases fresh?
Actually, I don't play any of those games now. What I do is crossword puzzles all the time. The New York Times crossword puzzles, I am there. I love them. But when I was a kid, the kind of game I would play was I would go sit out on the porch and I'd see something, say a tree. And so I would have my little 3x index cards and I would write all of the different words for tree. And then I would run in the house, ask my mother, what kind of tree is that? And then I would go out and I would add that. And so by the time I was through writing words about that tree, which I would work I'd go from the roots up, and I would be writing different words, not descriptions, different words for leaves. So it was very challenging. And the reason I think I started that is because, as you say, I was a lonely only, and I was living on a farm out in the middle of nowhere. And my books came from the bookmobile. But it all worked together. By the time I started school, and I've got to say how I learned how to read. This is disgraceful and funny both. My aunt Verla, was addicted to these true confession magazines, and she'd sit on the porch with me and she would read them out loud. I remember the first word I learned was the. And then the next word I learned was love. And then I learned pain. And it just went on like that. And then one day my aunt screwed up on a word because, we're not talking college graduate here. She screwed up on a word. So I corrected her. I said, no, that word is garage, not garage. And
oh my.
That we were off flying at that point.
Well, so you obviously have had a love of words for a long, long time.
Oh, yeah. I was born with it. The family history, and this might or might not come into play, but it's a great story. William Shakespeare's 2 grandmothers were both Webbs, and I have tracked my family back to Stratford-on-Avon at that time. Now, here's the thing you've got to, before you start bowing for me, you have to remember that at that time, anyone named Webb generally had a background as a weaver. And both Salisbury, England, and Stratford had a lot of weavers living amongst themselves. So okay. I could be related, and then again, I could not be. But I will say the words came easy for me.
Well, I think there must be some relationship there.
But I've never poached. Never poached.
Okay. Now, you have had good success, though, with both of your first series. You have 10 books in the Lena Jones series set in Arizona, 6 in the Zoo series set in California, and now you've got your brand new series, The Paris Mysteries, in, guess where? France. Now, why did you decide to go abroad for this story?
Well, it wasn't that I made a decision. When I was still living in Los Angeles, I went to a party. This was long ago, back in the history, the dark ages. Okay, I'm going to have to admit something here. I was an art student, and all my friends were either art students or writers. And we were playing kind of a parlor game, and we were stoned out of our minds, and we had our wine. And so we were pretty messed up. And we decided to play this game as if you could live anywhere at any time, where would you choose? And the person on the right is the one that started it. So everybody went around in a circle, and I was the last. And the first thing I said was, Paris, France in the 1920s. But I'd already been to Paris and fell in love with it. I was backpacking Europe by myself at the time. And I was only going to stay 2 days in Paris and go to the Louvre, but I wound up staying 2 weeks.
Oh my.
And so once I finished with Lena and Teddy, that's the zoo books, I couldn't figure out what I wanted to write next. And then one day I was grocery shopping. And as I was taking the groceries out of the car, it was like I got hit by a lightning strike. All of a sudden, the Zoe Barlow, who is the star of the Paris books, came into my head and started talking to me. All of her friends started talking to me. And by the time I had the groceries put away, I had that book in my head.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, it's never happened to me that way before, ever. It was very weird, very weird. My husband kept saying, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" I said, don't say anything. And finally, when it was all over, I said, "I just got an idea for a book. Let's go to Paris."
Oh. And he said, okay.
Yeah, he said, okay. Because our anniversary was coming up. And we thought, what the heck? Let's be in Paris on our anniversary.
Good. So a review describes Lost in Paris as mixing a cozy mystery and historical fiction with abandon while leaving room for some romance and strong female friendships. So tell us more about the first book.
Okay, I'm going to skip to the last one about strong female relationships. One of the reasons I don't read a lot of historicals, I read some, is because so many of them are tied to a romance. And I'm more interested in history than I am in romance. I mean, my mother was married 7 times. My dad was married 5 times. So when people start talking to me about romance, I go, yeah, right. And 10 cents will get you a cup of coffee. So I wanted friendships. And there was, once you write a book set in Paris, though, in the 1920s, and that first book is set in 1922, if you do not have sex in your book, then you are not being an honest writer. So I gave Zoe, my American expatriate, I gave her a mirrored bedroom. There's a mirror over her bed, which gets used in the book. But as for the wild abandon of history, well, yes, that's true. One of the things I've always been interested in is Hemingway, because, I teach writing. So I worship Hemingway's writing, worship it. And to me, one of the greatest tragedies in the world, at least literary tragedy, was that his wife lost all of his, not just book, all of the book in progress, his short stories, his articles. She left them unattended on a train. Somebody stole the valise that they were in, and he never got them back. And although I thought Hemingway was not the nicest guy in the world, he was no angel, his writing just gives me chills. That's how wonderful it is. So, and I tell all my students, read Hemingway. And I had to write about that. And so in my book, that valise is found by by Zoe. And most of the work is still in there. In fact, the last page, the last sentence in The Sun Also Rises is in my book, because I am paying an homage to Hemingway while I'm also saying, what a jerk. Because he treated his wife Hadley very badly,
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. But there were so many other people in there. And I was telling my hairdresser, he's French. He's from France.
Oh.
And I was telling him about the book, tell him what I was writing about. He said, oh, are you going to have Kiki in the book? I said, who's Kiki? He said, oh, my little love, I will bring you the story of Kiki. So he called me the next day and he said, okay, come on down, get your book about Kiki. He's an artist himself. And so Kiki, who is in my book, is sitting down, and on her back, the photographer has etched the shape of a violin. So I read that book and it changed everything. It changed my entire approach to the story. And in fact, that's why I dedicated my book to him, Laurent, who gave me the book that made all the difference.
So he's the one who actually introduced you to Kiki then.
That is right.
That didn't come out.
I knew the painting, not the painting, I'm sorry, the photograph, but I did not know about that much about her other than she sat for that one particular photograph. That was it.
See.
But boy, what a life she led. She was the ultimate flapper. People talk about Zelda, the American Zelda, Scott Fitzgerald's wife, about being the major flapper. The major flapper was Kiki.
All of his papers never were found. So somebody didn't find him and sell them or something?
Nope. No, because Hemingway was not famous then. He hadn't written, his first book had not been published yet. A couple of his short stories has. And he was a freelancer for an Ontario newspaper. And he was covering the peace talks over there that ended World War I. But no one knew him outside of the newspaper world. And since he was just basically a stringer, he wasn't all that famous about his newspaper articles either.
So when somebody found all that, the valise, they just probably pitched it or something and took the valise maybe.
Yeah.
Right?
After the World War I, things were so bad in France that they would have probably used it as tinder for a fireplace or a cook stove. I mean, that's how bad off the French were. They were literally starving. And well, a lot of people don't realize this, but Paris was bombed by the Germans. And especially the east side of Paris, they took a terrible, terrible hits. And so everyone was walking around maimed, burned, not enough food to eat. And because of that, there was a certain amount of irritation among the French for the wealthy Americans that were living there. And they were mainly living there so they could drink without being arrested. And France was having hard times, which actually played into the book because it shows not just the glamour of Paris, but the war wounds some of the soldiers had. In fact, Zoe gets involved with treating one of the men who had facial disfigurements. They were making copper masks, and then artists would paint in a realistic face that looked like they would work from a photograph of the man before his injuries. So that's what Zoe did. And she was beloved of the French because of that.
I see. So you and your husband had to go to Paris then to do some research, right?
Yeah. Well, I would say that was probably my sixth trip to Paris. It wasn't exactly the first since 1976.
Yeah, nice.
I kind of liked the town.
I guess so. So we're going to hear the first chapter of Lost in Paris in just a few minutes. But before we get to that, let's talk about some writing. What is your basic writing process like? And what is your best time to write?
Yeah. And here we're going to quote Hemingway. Hemingway said, and there's going to be a naughty word in this, so be prepared. Hemingway said, all first drafts are shit. And I believe that. I believe in taking pride in writing the shittiest first draft ever. And the reason for that is this. Your first draft, really, you should be writing from the gut, not the brain. The brain should only come in during the editorial process. That's all the brain is good for. A book, a novel should come from the gut. And then when you start doing your editing work, it will then come from the heart. And then finally, at the end, it moves up into the brain. But without that shitty first draft, which comes from the gut, you will have a heartless book.
Interesting.
And a gutless book. Like schedule is generally from 5 a.m. till around noon. But when I was still working as a reporter, and I had 4 books out before I retired from the newspaper, I would get up at 4 a.m. and I would write until 8 o'clock in the morning. Then I'd get cleaned up and go to work and write some more, of course. But now that I'm retired, I can write from 5. There are a few times I'm up at 6, but to even that out, there are still a few times I wake up at 4 and start writing, and then I'm done around 12. And after 12, I'm a human being. But I am not a human being before 12 because I'm in a different place. I am thinking French. I am seeing French. I am going to French places, eating French food. Oh, and another thing I do is when I started writing on the French book, I went out to the store and I bought myself Chanel No. 5. And so I spray myself with it first thing in the morning. Chanel No. 5. Oh, and she makes an appearance in the book too. So I've got a lot of real people in the book. Picasso's in there. He was a terror. He was an absolute terror. In fact, at that time, Karl Marx had gone through Paris. Freud had gone through Paris. It was an incredible time. One of the most brilliant times ever. How could I not write about that?
That's right.
In my DNA search, I'm part French.
Well, of course. Then that makes perfect sense.
I know.
Over all these years that you've been writing, what is the most surprising thing that you would say that you've learned about writing?
Here's the most surprising thing I've learned is you develop readers, constant readers along the way, and they love your books. Here's the big surprise. The more they know you and the more they've talked to you when you do your signings around town, around the country, because I generally will go on a national tour, they feel very comfortable as soon as your book is out and they've read it. They feel very comfortable saying, did you know that there is a typo on page 212, first paragraph, third sentence? That's just, it cracks me up. And see, by then I'd discovered it myself, so I'm whipping myself over it. But I love my readers, so I type back, thank you for letting me know. I will make sure my publisher corrects it, which of course is not true. They won't.
I see. So what are you working on next? There's going to be another Paris
That's
book?
right. I've already finished the Paris book number 2, which I think they've retitled it to The Clock Struck Murder, because an antique clock has a big part in it. And that comes out at the beginning of next May. But the book I'm working on now is the 3rd French book. And that is delving for the first time into the political situation in France. Because by then, the Russians had the revolution. They'd killed all the aristocrats they could catch. But the ones they couldn't catch made it the way to Paris. And so in Paris, there was this hotbed of hostility between those who were sympathetic to the communist revolution and those who were sympathetic to the French Republic. And I'm making it sound dry, but believe me, it's not going to be dry. There's going to be bloodshed because there was shooting in the streets over that. And right? So I've got a girl who hasn't made up her mind which way she feels, but she is the daughter of a wealthy winery owner. And then I've got a boy who is a student at the Sorbonne, and he is deep into communism will save us all. And she's in love with him. However, her background and her own personal beliefs, she's a little nervous about communism. And and then there's a couple of kidnappings, and there's a mistaken identity. On this one, I've taken the mirror off the ceiling in Zoe's bedroom. And there's a reason for that, which I won't go into, because the reason for it is introduced in the second French book. There's a missing child. So we've got 2 kidnapped women, and then we've got a missing child. So there's a lot. Then I can't go too much more than that.
That's okay. No
and
spoiler
then people get
alerts
killed.
there.
Yeah, they're always getting killed. I can't write a book without killing somebody.
Right. Absolutely. That's what we do, right?
Yeah, that's what we do.
Why don't you set up this section from the first chapter in Lost in Paris?
Let me read the back of my book.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Sure.
Okay. Paris. The subhead is "No One Can Hurt You Like Family." Paris, 1922. Zoe Barlow knows the pain of loss. By the age of 18, she had already lost her father to suicide and her reputation to an ill-fated love affair, not to mention other losses too devastating for words. Exiled from her home and her beloved younger sister by their stepmother, she was unceremoniously dumped in Paris without a friend to help her find her way. 4 years later, Zoe has forged a new life as a painter amidst fellow artists, expats, and revolutionary thinkers struggling to make sense of the world and the aftermath of war. She's adopted this lost generation as her new family, so when her dear friend Hadley Hemingway loses a valise containing all her husband Ernest's writings, Zoe happily volunteers to track it down. But her search for the bag keeps leading to murder victims, and Zoe must again face hard losses, this time among her adopted tribe. If she persists in her reckless quest to find the killer, the next life lost may be her own. Now, how she finds out about Hemingway's lost valise is in the poker game. She plays poker. She's a good gambler. Is the poker game she is attending in that first chapter. She's an outcast, and she's playing poker for extra money.
Lost in Paris, Chapter 1. Zoe, December 1922, Paris. Despite the sudden snowstorm, Poker Friday was going well at the pretty little house on Rue Vavine. Zoline Estacia Barlow, Zoe to her friends, was almost 1,400 francs up. But then the Marquis had to go and ruin everything. Too bad about Hemingway, is it not? Fortier said in that aristocratic nasal twang that always grated on Zoe's nerves. His poor wife will certainly pay the price. Although well into his 40s, Fortier's patrician face was clear of wrinkles, and despite the long scar on his cheek from German shrapnel, he'd fought bravely in the war to end all wars. He was still handsome. But handsome is what handsome does. "What are you talking about, Antoine?" Zoe asked, trying to keep the annoyance out of her voice. She held 2 pairs, trays, and 5s, and a lonely jack, but had been counting the cards and knew Fortier held 2 8s and at least 1 ace. Her friend Jewel Johnson, lead dancer at the Moulin Rouge, appeared to be hoping for a flush, and the infamous artist model Kiki of Montparnasse didn't have much of anything. Neither did Kiki's escort, Nick Stewart, of the filthy rich Boston Stewarts. Zoe couldn't decide what to do. Raise? Hold? Draw? Outside, a cruel gust of December wind rattled the house's tall windows, giving a twinge to her left leg, the one she'd broken as a child. But Zoe had fed enough coals into the ceramic-faced iron stove to keep the sitting room toasty. Even if a finger of chill did manage to creep inside, the excellent Montrachet they were drinking tasted robust enough to fight it off. With good friends, fine wine, and a possibly winning poker hand, all should have been well. But thanks to Fortier, it wasn't. Maybe she should stop inviting the old bore to her poker Fridays. Fanning away the cigarette smoke wafting toward her from his stinking desk, she said, "The last I saw of the Hemingways, they were fine." Fortier lifted one edge of his lip in a sneer, which irritated Zoe even more than his voice did. On one of her many trips to the Louvre, she'd come across a portrait of Fortier's lordly ancestor, the 6th Marquis Antoine Philippe Fortier de Guise, who'd lost his head in the French Revolution. The current Marquis's sneer was the same as his ancestors. Zoe tried her best to concentrate on her cards, but Fortier's comment stirred the other players too. Count Sergei Ivanovich Aronovsky, who had folded earlier, said, "You truly haven't heard of your friend Hadley's misfortune, Zoe? Why, all of Paris is abuzz." Dominique Garon, the war artist who'd lost an eye covering the Battle of the Marne, glared at Fortier with her remaining hazel orb. "Who cares about the Hemingways? Shut up and play your cards, Antoine, so we can get started on another hand." Like the Count, Dominique had already folded, recognizing danger when she saw it. Same as sculptor Karen Wagner, with whom Dominique was finishing off a bottle of cognac goulasse to drown her poker sorrows. As the war artist leaned back against her chair, a glowing shred of tobacco from her giton drifted down to the chair's maple arm. The expensive 15-piece Art Nouveau dining set had only been delivered last week, and Zoe was quite proud of it. Trying not to think about her new chair's fate, she said to the Count, "Since Fortier's so busy smirking, maybe you could tell me what's going on with the Hemingways. I've been too busy painting to keep up with the latest gossip." The Count gave her a gentle smile. She'd always seen a touch of El Greco in Sergei Ivanovich Aronovsky's gaunt, hollow-cheeked face. His arms and legs were thin, too, testaments to the hungry month he'd spent on the run from the Bolsheviks. "You announce you've been painting? Ha! As if we couldn't tell, dear Zoe. We can smell the turpentine and linseed oil from here. I don't understand why you can't copy the others of your kind and maintain a separate studio. It's certainly not because you're hurting for money." At this, Kiki giggled. Zoe didn't. "Your kind?" One aristocrat at the poker table was bad enough, but whenever two of them showed up on the same evening, snobbery ran rife, and Zoe sometimes found herself in sneaking sympathy with the mobs who dragged her friends' lordly forebearers to their deaths on the guillotine. True, the Count's woes were more recent than Fortier's. Only 5 years earlier, when the Bolsheviks took over Russia, the poor man lost his wife, his grand estate, and 2 Rembrandts. In the odd way of the world, his luck had almost immediately turned. Upon reaching the welcoming arms of Paris, he'd met and married a wealthy French widow. Shortly thereafter, he found himself widowed again. Despite the Count's travails, he still looked down at his nose on the untitled. One would think that Jules' love would cure him of his snobbery, but it hadn't yet. Zoe sighed, thinking it was no wonder the Bolsheviks had shot his kind against their tapestried walls. However, it was rumored Sergei had managed to escape the bloodbath with a small hoard of diamonds, and since he was a laughably bad poker player, she'd grown to appreciate the extra pin money his inclusion at her Poker Fridays earned her. Besides, despite his occasional bouts of arrogance, she'd grown fond of the man. Unlike other aristocrats she could mention, at least the Count had a heart. Feeling the need to defend the acrid aromas in her snug little house, she said, Now, Sergei, I'm a painter, and like most painters, I keep odd hours. 2 and 3 a.m. often find me working, so having my studio here keeps me from walking the streets in the wee hours and being confused with another sort of woman. At this, everyone laughed, but the mischievous Kiki pretended to find more than humor in Zoe's off-color joke. Walking the streets? But Zoe, Shaddy, it would be fun. Perhaps you and I could do that together. Since the raven-haired model spat with her lover, photographer Mon Ray, she'd been attending Zoe's Poker Fridays with a variety of new suitors, all of whom had loads of money. Zoe didn't mind. The young men were always good for a laugh, and wasn't that what Paris was all about? Laughter and good times. Nick Stewart, Kiki's suitor of the moment, wasn't a half-bad artist himself, despite the color blindness that ran amok through his inbred Boston family. But color blindness had never hampered a Dadaist, what with the urinals, hair clippings, and other nonsense objects they hung on gallery walls and called art with a capital A. Few of them bothered to paint anymore, including Nick, who is currently working on an installation combining shoelaces and chicken bones. Kiki's outre comment begged an answer. Walk the streets together, Kiki? Sorry, I must decline. I don't have what you French ladies call savoir-faire or your beauty, and I'd wind up with less than top-notch clientele. And who wants to have sex with hobos? Directing her attention back to the marquee, Zoe asked, Now, what were you saying about Ernest and Hadley? Not that Zoe cared about Ernest Hemingway, having once observed the bully sucker punch an inoffensive young man at La Cloderie des Lilas Café just for the thrill of seeing him fall. But she did care about Hadley. She'd often wondered how such a sweet-natured woman could put up with the ill-tempered man, who remained far from the success he imagined himself to have attained. Love, probably. Love that old betrayer. Love that old destroyer. For the past 4 years, Zoe had taken pains to avoid it. One broken heart was enough. Oblivious to his hostess's feelings, Fortier was more than happy to expound on the Hemingway scandal. The story I hear is that Hadley lost all of Ernest's manuscripts. Every word he ever wrote, even that certain-to-be terrible novel he was working on. Zoe frowned. That makes no sense. How could Hadley lose his manuscripts? She's not his secretary. I know the answer to that, the Count said, his mournful countenance buoyed by a semi-smile. It happened aboard a train. One of the porters at the Gare de Lyon, a Russian like myself, gave me chapter and verse of the incident. Do tell, since we're all agog, snapped Fortier, jealous that Sergei had stolen his place on the soapbox. With an indulgent nod, the Count cleared his throat. The story he then related was a troubling one, in which poor Hadley did indeed emerge as irresponsible. A few days earlier, while Ernest was in Switzerland reporting on the Lausanne conference, he'd run into a publisher who asked to see some of his fiction. Thrilled, as any aspiring novelist would be, Ernest immediately telegraphed Hadley, who had stayed behind in Paris, to post him a few stories and his unfinished novel. Under most circumstances, this would have been a sensible enough request. But Hadley had fallen ill with the flu, Sergei continued, which is why she hadn't accompanied Ernest to Lausanne in the first place. Anxious to please her husband, she'd staggered around their tiny apartment, collecting the manuscripts, and in her delirium, packed up the carbons as well. She stuffed everything into a valise. Hoping to surprise him, she hitched a ride with their landlord to the Gare de Lyon, where she bought a ticket on the Paris-Lausanne Express. Once aboard, Hadley placed the valise under her seat. Still feverish, she went back out to the platform to purchase a bottle of Evian for the long journey. "The porter told me that when the poor woman returned to her seat, the valise was gone," Sergei finished. "So, I ask you, Zoe, an important question, one for you which, as her most trusted friend, should have the most informed answer. Yes, all Paris is aware of Ernest's habit of knocking down unsuspecting men in cafes, but do you know if he is also in the habit of knocking down his wife? Given the enormity of her crime, should we worry about pretty Hadley's safety?" Zoe was so miffed it took her a moment to answer, and when she did, she discovered she'd lost the poker hand. Kiki, the little sneak, had been holding an inside straight and had been too foxy to let it show. The sly cat was still raking in the francs when Zoe finally found her voice. "Ernest may be a bully boy in the cafes, Sergei, but I doubt he hits Hadley. She's the one with the money, remember? Did I hear you say she packed the originals and carbons?" "Everything." As much as Zoe hated to admit it, Sergei might be right. Poor Hadley. Zoe had met Hadley earlier in the year when the Marquis, already a poker-playing regular, invited Zoe to accompany him to one of Gertrude Stein's famous evenings. Gertrude, who looked and acted more like a Roman emperor than a woman, had gained fame for her foresight in championing the talents of Picasso, Matisse, and others while they were still unknowns, and now she reigned supreme in the salons of Paris. To be granted entree into one of her gatherings signaled that your work was being taken seriously, so Zoe was thrilled to accept Fortier's invitation. A meeting with Gertrude would surely turn her luck around. It hadn't worked out that way. The evening had started off promisingly enough, with everyone feasting at a table spread with rare delicacies. But after the housekeeper whisked away the remnants, the mood changed. Instead of allowing Zoe to join in the conversation with the other artists and writers, all male, she noted, Gertrude insisted she join the wives and mistresses in a small adjoining room. With a condescending smile, the big woman explained, "Ladies always enjoy talking to Alice. She knows so much about running a household, sewing and cooking and such." Sewing and cooking and such? Oh, bourgeois. Deeply offended, the only reason Zoe hadn't sloshed her wine into Gertrude's face was because she didn't want to further humiliate Fortier. The moment Gertrude made her pronouncement, he'd flushed with embarrassment, and his mouth opened and opened again as he tried to find the proper words to decry their host's prejudice. Taking pity on him, Zoe stood up and, with the rest of the ladies, filed out of the room. She was spoiling for a fight, though, and was looking forward to giving Alice a piece of her mind. But once she was settled in a room overstuffed with paintings and furniture, Hadley, who sat next to her on the uncomfortable horsehair sofa, leaned over and whispered, "Patience, Zoe. It'll be ugly, but you'll survive. We all will." Zoe had noticed Hadley earlier, her enviable porcelain skin much smoother than Zoe's own, the glorious auburn hair cut into a flapper's bob, and the dance of intelligence in those blue-gray eyes. She appeared several years older than her husband and nowhere near as pretty, and Hadley's long, slender fingers revealed the gifted pianist she was reputed to be. "Does Gertrude do this often?" Zoe whispered back. "Banish the females to Purda? Every damn time." But Hadley placed a beautifully manicured forefinger against her lips. "Shh, here comes Alice." Zoe found Alice Toklas less condescending than Gertrude. If anything, the small woman seemed a bit shy. But the following discussions of petty point and the proper mincing of truffles bored her, and only Hadley's witty asides made the experience bearable. By the time the evening was over, Zoe realized she'd found a kindred spirit. Since then, hardly a week passed when she and Hadley did not share a drink, or 3, at La Rotonde. Sometimes Hadley would even visit the little house on the Rue Vavin and serenade her with mini concerts of Bach or Handel on Zoe's gavoux upright. When in a particularly rebellious mood, usually after another humiliating visit to Gertrude's with her vain husband, she'd pound out jazz. Now Zoe's friend was in big trouble. And that was Chapter 1 from Betty Webb's new novel, Lost in Paris. Thank you so much for being with us on the podcast today, Betty.
Oh, it was wonderful. Wonderful. I love to have fun like this.
Thank you so much.
I'm usually too busy writing to have fun.
Well, you're always fun to talk to, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
You can read a short story from her protagonist, Zoe Barlow, on Betty's website. The title is The Scent of Murder, a Zoe Barlow short story. That's at bettywebb-mystery.com. Betty Webb is WEBB-mystery.com. Betty's active on Facebook at bettywebb.writer, and the details are in the show notes. Our author extra today is Karen Randau of Payson, Arizona, in the mountains north of the Phoenix area. Following a degree in journalism and public relations from the University of Texas at Austin, her career spanned the industries of high-tech, mental health, and nonprofits. She started having strange thoughts in her head and thought something might be wrong. When she confessed this to a friend one day and asked, "Do you think I'm crazy?" the friend answered, "No, I think you have a novel in you that wants to get out." That began her fiction writing career, and that idea turned into her debut novel, Deadly Deceit, the first in her 4-novel Rim Country Mystery series. She's also penned the Frankie Shep suspense series, the Kayla Walsh mystery suspense trilogy, and the Peach Blossom romantic suspense series. More are on the way. Check out all of Karen Randau's books at KarenRandau.com, and that's RANDAU. The links are in the show notes. There's one more episode in this second season of Murder in the Air Mystery Theater podcast. Be back here next time when on episode number 31, you'll hear my short crime fiction story, Death by Deception. If you're listening on the podcast platform of your choice, please subscribe and leave a review or provide us with feedback. If you're on YouTube at Read Laurie Fagen, please subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and click on the bell to be notified when a new episode has been released. And for some freebies, check out our Patreon page at Murder in the Air Mystery Theater. For more information, you can visit readlauriefagen.com. Thanks so much for listening, and come back again, where you'll always find Murder in the Air.